Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the WA Museum here in Geraldton. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Catherine Belcher and I'm the Regional Manager here. And tonight we have our final speaker for the Series 1 of the Harry Butler Lecture Series in the Wild West, a lecture series brought to you by the WA Museum to recognise the 2010 International Year of Biodiversity. Dr. Rick Howe is a staff member of the Western Australian Museum and is based in Perth. He's had 40 years research experience as a vertebrate ecologist and biogeographer, working extensively in Australia and Indonesia, as well as conducting specific studies in Sri Lanka and China. His first responsibility on joining the WA Museum 32 years ago was to coordinate the Northern Swan Coastal Plain Fauna Study, a study that examined the impact of the first 150 years of European settlement on the fauna of the Swan region. He's continued this interest in local fauna by undertaking numerous studies of remnant vegetation patches in the Perth metropolitan area over these last 3 decades, and he has conducted a detailed study on the herpetofauna of Bold Park to determine the habitat preferences of species, their seasonal activity, responses to fire, and relationships to long-term climatic fluctuations. So tonight he is going to talk to us about biodiversity in the burbs. Please welcome Dr. Rick Howe.
Thanks very much, Catherine. It always staggers me how old I've got, and it suddenly snuck up on me. 40 years is a dreadfully long time, but I was fortunate enough to come from the eastern states, like probably many of you have, and my first role here, as Catherine said, was to be involved in a study for which I suddenly got very passionate and which I've continued over the next 40-odd years. And it's a result of that I wanted to sort of bring you some of the what I think are exciting discoveries that have come out of the work that we've done, not only because apologetically it's very Perth-centric, but also this has strong implications for almost any urban area, almost anywhere in the world. And I hope as we go through the talk today that you'll get some inclination of exactly what the importance levels may well be to a place like Geraldton, which is growing at such a fast rate. The biodiversity in the burbs, as I've already said, will focus very much on the discoveries that I have made with my colleagues and friends over the last 35 to 40 years. And it'll also focus very much on the vertebrate groups. And I will come back regularly to vegetation because that's obviously a critical component of why so many of the vertebrate groups are in the position they are currently. But to start with, and I'm sure that you've had other speakers this year which will have recognised the significance of the International Year of Biodiversity. It was decreed by the United Nations General Assembly, and it had 4 particular aims, and to quote from them, it was an opportunity to stress the importance of biodiversity for our well-being, and I'll come back to that as one of the final points I make. It's a chance to reflect on our achievements to safeguard biodiversity so far, and of course I'll point out the inadequacies of what I've been able to discover, and certainly the inadequacies of what has actually happened, and to encourage a redoubling of our efforts to reduce the rate of biodiversity loss. And I hope that I will give you some indication of why it's so significant that we retain biodiversity in what is a very important year. And as it says at the very bottom, we all have to apply effort in order to save biodiversity because it requires a collaborative and a cooperative attempt. The things that I will be focusing on really is the teaching component out of the work that we've been looking at through the museum. And really the 3 major things I want to get across to you today, if I possibly can, and I hope I can entertain your interest long enough to do that. I first of all want to examine Perth's urbanisation and the impact it's had. And that, as you'll see, will correlate fairly much with reflect on our achievements so far that the United Nations suggested as one of the principal goals. I'd also like to, towards the end, illustrate the actual importance of the Australian lifestyle and its ecological footprint and what that might mean to biodiversity. And finally, just bring you some of the work that I have got quite interested in as to how biodiversity relates to societal well-being or to actually individuals' well-being and good health, because there's now a lot of medical work which I think has great relevance to why biodiversity itself is far more important than we ever gave it credit for previously. To start with a slide which is always one of my favourites, basically the world at night to show the centres of population. If we translate that into a global pattern, you will see that the high areas of population density, the darker ones, are focused very much on China and India, as we all know, but in Europe. And you also have patches throughout. Australia characteristically has its little eastern states areas of high population density. And there are many parts of the world which are very low in population density. The next slide actually translates this into, in fact, the component of urbanisation. And you may well be a bit amazed here to find that places like India and China suddenly become far less important in the ranking. The darker is the higher levels of urbanisation, the lighter are the lesser areas of urbanisation. And that's because most of those populations live in small rural villages or kampongs or whatever we call them. But you can see Australia, America and much of Europe has very much a high level of urbanisation. And it is a growing interest and a growing concern as to what the impact of that urbanisation will be on the natural environment. And I'm also hopeful that you're very much aware that we are very fortunate in southwest and Western Australia to be located in one of the global biodiversity hotspots. In the early 2000, the World Wildlife Fund and Conservation International looked at ways to try and apportion the globe into areas where there was significant biodiversity. And the southwest of Western Australia is the only Australian one. It is one of the few in the developed world, and it makes it highly significant for a lot of the issues which you will be familiar with around Geraldton, as we are in Perth, and so is Albany and much of the southwest. And it's that biodiversity hotspot which has got a lot of interest in the biodiversity of southwest and Western Australia, and a lot of more research and money is being ploughed into it. It's also worth noting that within Australia we also have 15 biodiversity hotspots. And being a nice parochial sound groper, I am only interested in what's west of the 129th parallel. And you can see that there are 8 of the 15 Australian biodiversity hotspots represented in Western Australia. Geraldton sits smack bang in the middle of one, as does Perth. As you can see, there are at least 5 in the southwest corner, and hence globally it's a very significant area. And a biodiversity hotspot is really defined by the richness and the endemism, that is, species that have confined to that area, of plants and most likely vertebrate animals, which are the group that we know most about. If we then just take ourselves away a little from the global perspective and look at just the Australian component, again you can see where the areas of major density are. But this slide always staggers me because it shows so clearly what is confronting us in southwest or in Western Australia at large, the area between Shark Bay in the north and east of Esperance in the southeast, and just the massive transformation that has occurred in the landscape within this major global biodiversity hotspot. It's fair to point out the wheat belt, the great swathe of clearing for the agricultural area, but also the major marked changes that have occurred along the Swan Coastal Plain. So although we are a biodiversity hotspot, we're also a place where habitat has been severely fragmented and most of it has been lost. And hence, conservation-wise, there's a great deal of concern as to the ongoing persistence of much of the biodiversity that we have. If I just transfer this a little bit to Geraldton, because you will see again most focal places like cities do in fact want to spread up and down the coast. And this is the reference that I'll bring to you as I talk about Perth particularly, because we all want to live somewhere near the coast, and in so doing we often fragment, we often change, and we often decline in the biodiversity of those particular areas, which is often quite specific. Also, while I have the opportunity, this is one of the wonderful chances I've had to fly back from the Abrolhos, which I want to touch on very briefly later on to bring a little bit of local interest. But Geraldton, as you can see again, does have some remnant biodiversity patches, native patches. There are patches scattered throughout it, and these will become very significant as we start to learn more about what is in fact the biodiversity of the Geraldton area. Before I started this work this year, I had a quick look at what we know of the very small precinct which is Geraldton. And in fact we have 57 species of reptiles and amphibians that occur within the city boundaries basically. Whether they still all persist or not, I would be quite surprised, but The museum has records of a very high level of at least reptilian and amphibian biodiversity for this area. And a slide which I really do enjoy because it takes me to the Abrolhos is one of the rather magnificent carpet pythons out there in ambush posed, and right behind it is one of its major prey items, an escaping tammar wallaby. But again, and I'll come back to the Abrolhos because it does have some lessons for us, I think, in what might well be the case of the future of biodiversity in this region. But as I said, unapologetically, this is very much Perth-centric, and this is just another landscape image of the general Perth area. You can see the Swan River, you can just see the outline of Rocknest to the east. But in 1925, this is the outline of the Perth Statistical Division, in other words, the urban areas of Perth. Some 50 years later, you can see the expansion of Perth as it really did develop up the Swan River all the way into the Scarp. By 2002, right in the centre of the time that my study has been going on, sizable chunks of country have disappeared, and the major development of urban and peri-urban regions extends right back to the Darling Scarp. And the most recent map I could find, 2008, shows very clearly this remarkable desire for people to live along the coast as we cut our urban development right along the coastal dune systems. What I want to do is just look very much more closely at central Perth, and if we do this, you can see very clearly the degree of, it's got a wonderful title, I think it's called a photogrammetric map, where the green is artificially coloured, but you can see golf courses, but you can also see that there are some fairly significant patches of bush. And I'll come back to those a little bit later on because they become focal in the sorts of studies we've been doing as to the impact of major urban development on small patches of remnant vegetation. The earliest photographs are probably about the 1880s, 1890s, around about the time Kings Park was first gazetted as a national park. But this is a very early painting of the Swan River colony done from Mount Eliza. And if I can show you this marked contrast, this is about 18 or 19 years after the establishment of the colony. And here's the same view taken in 2007. And again, it's one of the most clear examples I can show you of how dramatically changed the urban area has been in central Perth. As you can see here, the development is going on with the new rail line being put in, which of course is now quite well developed, and also the convention centre there in the foreground. There's a lot of reclaimed land, there is a lot of built over land, and just in that marked period of time we can see the transformation that's occurred in the natural environment, and consequently many of the changes have also spilled into the waterways as well. This hodgepodge, which I won't really, it's part of a slide which I usually use to try and highlight to students the importance of biodiversity, but this pie chart is perhaps the best way of getting it across to you. What we as vertebrate biologists get very excited about are the birds, the reptiles, the mammals and the amphibians. And these I've coloured in little segments right up at the apex of this pie chart. And you can see how insignificant they are in numbers. Nearly 50% of the fauna of Western Australia is made up of insects, nearly all of which we are almost grossly ignorant about. There is a sizable component which are made up of chelicerates, which are basically the spiders and the mites. There's a small group of myriapods, which are the millipedes and centipedes, and a big lump of crustaceans, mainly in the marine world, and so on it goes. So our focus is on a very, very small part of the overall biodiversity when we're talking a vertebrate component. It's not to say that they're not important, and one of the things that is so useful about vertebrates is we have this long history of having studied them, and therefore we have an understanding of what they can teach us about changes over the longer term. We are still struggling to find names for most of the invertebrate groups that we have. There are some like the jewel beetles, which are well known, and the butterflies, which are fairly well known amongst the insects. But basically the vertebrates as a group are pretty well known. But they make up just 3% of the fauna of Western Australia, a remarkably small component. So if I can take you now just to where I started from. In 1977, when I first arrived, we were undertaking a study for the Department of Environment and Conservation. No, it was Department of Conservation and Environment then, sorry, which then became the EPA later on, in a study of what the likely impacts of water drawdown on the Nangara Mound would have been on the fauna. And this is the little circle in red. It was basically the North Swan coastal plain from the Swan River up as far as the Moore River. We chose 8 major blocks of country, mainly national parks and reserves, covering some 35,000 hectares. The museum did some surveys of that, but more particularly it looked at the literature, it looked at its collections, and it came up with some fairly startling discoveries, which I'll bring to you in the next slide. Following up from that, after we'd finished that study, in the mid-80s, my colleague John Dell and I decided we'd like to look at remnant patches, smaller patches of native vegetation within Perth proper. And why did we do that? Well, we said to ourselves that the public really is always asking us stuff about what is still left in Perth, and we as museum biologists had very little idea about that at all. So over the next decade, we looked at 34 small remnants, as you can see, covering only a very small area, just about 2,000 hectares. And we did that through repeated surveys. We did that through sampling in different years of the same site, just to make sure we didn't miss out on trying to understand what was still left in these small patches of vegetation left in Perth. I've continued that on because I'm a bit of a fool, I suspect, but for the last 24 years I've been studying Bold Park, which is a lovely piece of native bush halfway, well, it's closer to the beach than it is to the city, but it's one of the last big remnants within Perth, and it's presided over by the Kings Park and Botanic Parks and Gardens Authority, along with Kings Park, and together they make up a very, very interesting part of our biodiversity heritage within inner urban areas. So the latter part has focused very much on the central part of Perth and the peri-urban regions, and it's out of that that I will come to the next slide, which gives you some idea of exactly what we've come up to as far as the biodiversity, particularly focusing on the vertebrates, of the Swan coastal plain and urban Perth really do. If we look at the frogs, you can see that on the Swan coastal plain, when we did our study, we didn't find any species had gone extinct or were not there that should have been there. But when we started to look at the inner urban areas, we found 27%, or nearly a third of the frogs that we thought should be there were no longer there. When we did a study of the birds, there were 3 species that we were able to show in historic times had become extinct. 6 species, there's nearly 200 birds. 6 species that had become extinct on the Swan coastal plain. But when we came into looking at the inner urban remnants, the small patches within proper suburbia, we found that nearly half of them had become locally extinct. The mammals, a tragic story. Even when we did our study of the northern Swan coastal plain, we found that nearly 37% had now disappeared, and that's really of the ground mammals because we knew very little about the bats. But on inner urban areas, and I'll come back to this again, nearly 75% had become locally extinct. Mammals and urban development and small patches are not compatible. As far as the reptiles go, a good story. Nothing was lost that we could find out 30 years ago. A few species disappear that should be in inner urban remnants that are no longer there, although I did have a friend who turned up one in Herdsman's Lake the other day to show me that one of the skinks that we thought was locally extinct still has a population in Herdsman's Lake. A very exciting discovery. And finally, and certainly by no means least, looking at the vegetation, by the late 70s, about 45% of the vegetation, the natural native vegetation, the Swan coastal plain, had been cleared or altered. If you come into the Perth and peri-urban areas of Perth, nearly 3/4 have gone. And you may recall that one of the good bits of news last Tuesday was that the government has now gazetted some 51,000 hectares of land under the Bush Forever program as important bushland for the preservation and conservation of biodiversity. So that's a great big plus, but it's been nearly 10 years in the making. So we have this sad scenario of many of the vertebrate groups have suffered declines in the inner urban area, not so badly in the outer urban area, but mammals particularly have suffered dramatically as a result of the time that Europeans have occupied this particular part of Western Australia. Now, if we turn our attention to natural vegetation, this becomes very important because, as I said, it is the key driver of allowing most of the biodiversity of the fauna to persist. And it's important, as it says here, for the conservation and preservation of natural biodiversity. Native vegetation patches are also the refugia, or at least the owners of unique vegetation types, and also unique plant species and animal species. So they contain unique species of our biodiversity. They also require a huge amount of active management because small patches in urban areas are always prone to a whole lot of intrusions by anthropogenic, or in other words, human-induced factors. And if it's not weeds, it's dogs, or it's or it's horses, or it's any number of things. Active management is an ongoing concern for all of our bushland patches. And they also provide a little area that we'll come back to, opportunities for learning, which is what I've been grateful for, certainly by going out and studying what happens in these bushland patches, but also an improvement in one's health. And that's an area that a lot of work is now being done on, not so much in Australia, but certainly overseas. And it's a burning area of interest to show people that natural areas are significant to both their well-being and, in fact, decreasing illness. And finally, but by no means least, I don't want to dwell too much on this one, but perhaps the most important, that natural bushland provides essential ecosystem services. Now, that's a word that is buzzed about a lot in the conservation literature these days, but basically without natural vegetation, we don't have clean air, we don't have purified water, we don't have nutrient cycling, we don't have pollinating vectors, we don't get rid of waste rubbish. And so there's so many things that are inherent in the processes that these natural environments allow to persist, that it becomes critically important that they are retained there. You can imagine that our wonderfully English coiffured gardens are not the places that have the same inherent ecosystem processes like nutrient recycling or like carbon fixation. So native bushland patches are essential for providing the services that we as European, well, any humans in fact, need. And not just us, most of the animals which persist in them as well. So let me come back then to perhaps areas that are a little more attuned. I mentioned to you before that frogs had suffered very little as a result of the changes on the Swan coastal plain, and only minimally as far as the inner urban areas went. We found 15 species in our study of the urban areas. 14 of these were on the Swan coastal plain. That means one was in the hills. And we found there are very few local extinctions. That is a picture of a beautiful little burrowing frog, the Myobatrachus. It's very much closely related to the ones in the dunes up here in the way that its life history performs and also in a molecular sense. Birds, there were species which we found no longer extant on the Swan coastal plain. This is the rufous tree creeper, but we also can well and truly document some dramatic increases in numbers. Not only the rainbow lorikeet, but we've seen the corellas, we've seen so many of these species really take off in numbers in the last 25 or 30 years. One of the great joys, though, is that there were a lot of birds to start with, and as I mentioned before, there were only 6 that we could find had become locally extinct. We also, though, managed to document, as a result of looking through the literature and the history, because birds are perhaps the best documented group of vertebrates, that nearly 50% of them have declined dramatically in number. So, as you might expect, if you start to alter the landscape, if you start to fragment the native vegetation, you will fragment the populations and consequently their numbers decrease markedly. But one of the things about birds is they can move, and they do move, and they still move quite easily between patches, and so many of the species are still able to be seen within Perth. And this gives us a false sense of security in many ways, because seeing isn't necessarily believing that they will persist. As for mammals, as I said, the story is dramatic and rather tragic. Australia has the world's worst record for survival of mammals. We have lost more species than most continents. Certainly percentage-wise, we've lost a dramatic number. Of the 220-odd species of mammals in the state, about 5% are now extinct or have become extinct since Europeans occupied the continent just over 200 years ago. If we bring ourselves to the Swan coastal plain, as I mentioned before, there has been a huge loss of species. There is nearly 55% have now, we believe, disappeared from the Swan coastal plain that were originally here. If you come into the metropolitan area, the story is even more tragic. And Kings Park is the highlight for me, because there is a lovely native bushland patch of which we only have one mammal species still extant, that's the brush-tailed possum. And it's this change of mammal numbers that is so marked and so tragic. The little ashy grey mouse still persists on the Swan coastal plain but doesn't occur in the metropolitan region. The quenda or southern brown bandicoot still occurs in the metropolitan region, but it doesn't occur in Pings Park despite the best laid surveys that we've put in place. And as I said, the only native mammal which still persists in inner urban areas is the common brush-tailed possum. So mammals find it particularly difficult to survive even in the biggest of our urban bushland patches. With reptiles, one of the really elegant spiny-tailed gecko group, we have in Perth small populations of Australia's most threatened reptile, the western swamp tortoise, which is only known from Twin Swamps and Ellenbrook and is now captive bred by the zoo for release elsewhere, but still in a parlous way as far as its survivorship goes. The importance of it is actually that it's an evolutionary dead end. It's a lineage almost on its own amongst the turtle, and that's what makes it so important. The genetic makeup of this particular beast is very different to most of the others. Amongst the reptiles, we have lots of snakes. One of the stories that I'm most excited about at Bold Park is the high proportion of small snake species we still have there, although we are losing some. But snakes still preside fairly well in the urban areas. This is what we used to call legless lizards, but probably more technically correct now to call them legless geckos, because many of the legless lizards are much more closely related to the geckos than they are to other groups. And in fact, there has been a fairly major change in taxonomic or in classification of the species in the last 5 years as a result of a lot of genetic work being done in very sophisticated labs around the place. Not that it need worry you, except that it always interested me that legless lizards that look so different are in fact very similar to geckos in so many ways. And of course, we have legless skinks. That's a real conundrum for those of us that work in the reptile world, but many of the skinks live underground. They've really lost their legs. This is a small skink that has just a couple of vestigial flaps left where its legs should be. Sorry, I'm having a problem with this, aren't I? And finally, another group of monitors which still persist in reasonable numbers within Perth, which is exciting because monitors are really the top-end carnivores in the reptile world, and the fact that they will persist in some bushland remnants means that the food chain underneath them is probably still quite intact. So there's a lot of stories that we can get out from any one group, but reptiles have survived far better than certainly mammals have. Not maybe as well as birds, and certainly they've survived a bit about the same as amphibians go. But I want to use reptiles because it's a group that is still found fairly commonly throughout the Perth urban area, and just give you a few insights as to what they can in fact tell us. As I mentioned before, we had looked at please don't get excited too much by this horrible map, but it's a sophisticated way of saying if you have a suite of species in one particular area and a suite of species in another area, how similar are they? And you can use similarity indices, and then you can statistically run it through a multivariate analysis program, which is what this has done, really to try and show graphically how similar areas are in their reptile faunas. And this little graph here will show you this block of country here in the Darling Scarp is very similar. So all the sites that we had monitored on the Darling Scarp and Plateau have a very similar reptile assemblage. Likewise, we found that Rottnest and Garden Island themselves had very similar reptile assemblages. And finally, this big block of country, which was across the Swan coastal plain, had very similar reptile assemblages. So the colours represent a statistically significant grouping. So you can see that there are distinct patterns of use of the Swan coastal plain by reptiles, which is really a very interesting discovery because it means we can't treat coastal areas as one homogeneous mass. And that comes back to the comments I made earlier about near coastal areas are very significant because they contain things that aren't likely to be found further inland. To make the science of this a little bit more interesting, the line that I've drawn across the middle really actually bisects the Swan coastal plain. And so the species on the west of the Swan coastal plain are somewhat different in their makeup to those on the east. And as so-called good scientists, the little arrows show repeat sampling, because what we really want to do is see whether our sampling is an artefact of just doing it once, or whether our repeat sampling shows us that these communities are in fact real events that do repeat themselves. And so, encouragingly, out of this particular piece of work of looking at the remnants, we are able to show that reptiles do see the Swan coastal plain in a myriad of lights, in very different sets of parameters than we ourselves might have done. Very quickly, to translate that to a local area which you'll all be familiar with, the wonderful Hootman abrolhos, which I've been fortunate enough to work on for 7 or 8 years with friends from DEC here and the colleagues at the museum. I'm sure you're all more familiar with it than I am, but it does hold some wonderfully interesting reptiles. Here's one of the burrowing snakes, Samoselaps littoralis. It also, up top, is a picture of what we find on the abrolhos in that particular bucket, and that's how we trap most of our reptiles. We put in 20-litre buckets in the ground. We have one of the endemics of the abrolhos, which is the spiny-tailed skink, which is originally described from there, and which is in a very important population, in fact, a very important species in its own right. We've also recently turned up one of the mainland species on East Wallaby Island, the ornate gecko, which was not known out there before, which makes it a very significant little population because it's obviously been out there for many, many millennia. And finally, a very new worm lizard, which we have already discovered and is yet to be named from East Wallaby Island also. So the abrolhos is turning up some wonderful little hidden treasures. By surveying lots of different islands, we've also been able to show that they themselves, again, one of these horrendous multidimensional scaling maps, but the patterns that I want to draw to your attention, the yellow islands are those which are coral rubble islands. In other words, they're just made up of loose dead coral pieces. Long Island, Swami, 2 in the southern group, in the Pelsart group, they have very few reptiles, and they all have tramp species. The next major group are these blue islands, which are remnants of the mainland. And on them we find the species that, in fact, like the spiny-tailed geckos, like king skink, and like many of the big species, they occur on these substantial remnants of the mainland. We have a third group, which is North Island and Rat Island. That's a bit of a conundrum. North Island is a big island, as you're aware, but it hasn't been well sampled. Rat Island is quite a big island, but it's been highly modified. And it may well be that those two cluster together as similar because they have been poorly sampled. That's a strong possibility. And of course, the piece de resistance out there is the wallabies themselves. They have a remarkably rich and diverse reptile fauna. They also have tama wallabies and bush rats, although sadly the bush rat on East Wallaby is now extinct. But the wallabies themselves, the Wallaby Islands and the abrolhos in total, give us some measure of what may happen, and I'll come back to that point, what may happen in Geraldton in years to come, because I'm going to use the example in Perth between my own study and Rocknest and Garden. So we are fortunate in the Midwest to have such a jewel out there as the abrolhos Islands. When I get very excited, I call them Australia's Galapagos, but obviously not quite that yet. This rather difficult one is the 5 major steps I want to try and tell you that we have been really negligent on as far as good preservation of biodiversity. Fragmentation is a process of modification or changing the natural environments quite markedly, and it is the major reason why so many of our species have been lost as far as extinction in totality or local extinction, because we have altered their environments, changed it and made it much smaller. I'll come back to the studies of the Swan coastal plain in just a minute. Invasive species, or to put it more commonly, pest species, these are the introduced alien species, and there's a plethora of names. I've just been debating with Canberra who want to call them novel species. I think it's an oxymoron because all species are novel, but invasive or pest species like foxes, cats, so many of the things that we have brought with us are also hugely detrimental to the persistence of native biota. Fire, an issue which has been around probably forever. The changes that have occurred since Europeans have got involved in biodiversity, got involved in this part of the world, have been a change in the intensity and frequency. And this, I will show you, is fairly easy to document but very hard to correct. Diseases. Disease impacts on population size. It is an area that is getting an awful lot more focus recently because we now have the molecular tools, we have the analytical tools, and the, if you like, the biomedical appraisals that we can make to see if, in fact, disease is important. Up until now, it's mainly been anecdotal. And one of the reasons that many of the mammals disappeared, people said, was because there was a thing called a marasmus or epizootic, or in fact just a disease, which spread through the southwest in the 1920s and before the foxes came. And there is no great information for that, but there's a strong evidence for it from anecdotal work. And there's been a very nice paper published recently to bring that to the fore. And finally, we're all aware of climatic change, and that's one of the areas that I have a sizable interest in, because with a long-term study like I've been doing, you can start to see some of the impacts of change in rainfall regime, at least on the species that that currently exist. So fragmentation. A slide of Perth taken in 1977 before Burswood, before an awful lot of things, but it shows just how old we are, but it does highlight the wonderful extent of Kings Park here and further out Bold Park, and in the far distance Rottnest, a key island that I'll come back to. And coming back to that wonderful map I showed you earlier on, to see this from the space, Bold Park on the left, Kings Park on the right, the two big blocks of native vegetation in central Perth, and we have literally tens of others that we have been studying, and these red arrows point to these small fragments that we've been looking at right through the inner urban area. But as you can see, none of them are connected. They're all fragmented by a matrix of urban development or industrial development or by major highways, and this has a profound effect on the species that live within them and also the abilities of species to move between them. Birds can make it sometimes, but most of the others certainly can't. What does that actually tell us? And I don't want you to worry too much, except this is again the evidence of those 34 remnant studies that we looked at. What we did find that big is better. For small remnants, the smaller the remnant on the left, the larger the remnant on the right, and the number of species. So for snakes, you find the larger the area, the more snakes. It stands to reason. Snakes like larger areas. There's more prey species. There's a chance of the population being bigger and hence surviving. As far as the lizards go, those that aren't skinks also show a similar pattern. So on small areas you get smaller numbers, like the geckos or the monitors, or in fact the dragon lizards. The larger areas, the larger number of species. But surprisingly, when we come to the skink lizards, and I showed you a legless skink before, you find there's no difference, because skinks can persist in reasonable numbers on very small remnants. But that's actually a very exciting discovery, because that means that even small remnants can be important to some parts of our biodiversity. We often dismiss them as being useless as far as retaining biodiversity, but the point is they do allow several species to persist, and that's an important outcome of the work we've been doing. If I swing to that invasive species, the second point I made, or pest species, first of all, there are weeds, and weeds are basically the rude word for invasive plants. This is a picture of a tulip woodland. Veldtgrass is preeminent in the foreground here, a wonderful fire tool. This is taken in the spring, and some of that will dry off and be a wonderful fuel for fire. Interspersed with this is pelargonium, another South African weed that's been brought in, and I think about a third of the plant species in Bold Park are now regarded as weeds. Other critically important invasive species are cats. We all know how effective they are as predators. They are perhaps the reason why many of our small mammals have disappeared, or in fact are disappearing. Foxes, which we know are incredibly significant in keeping some of the larger of the smaller mammals in a very low state. With fox baiting, there has been a release of the pressure of that predation, and many of our native species recovered. However, when you don't bait for foxes, you often find that the numbers drop off dramatically again. So the evidence is very strong that cats and foxes are very effective predators. Rabbits, we all know, are highly significant, more in the arid zone, but even in urban areas they come in and they nip off the buds of the regenerating native species, and it makes revegetation, or it makes even any sort of regeneration very difficult. The one that I'm most concerned about, and it's one that goes unnoticed to those of you that have them in your house, is the little house mouse. The house mouse is everywhere in Australia. Actually, that's not true. It's not really in the tropical north. But in Perth, it goes through major cycles. And the significance of that is really only just starting to dawn on us. We, in fact, get mouse plagues in Perth about once every 3 or 4 years. It's probably correlated with autumnal rains the year before. But that's not the important point. The important point is when mouse numbers get high, they're out there feeding on the grain to start with, which is obviously what the grain sets the mice breed, and therefore they feed on these young shoots of grasses and succulents that come through. What happens when those dry off and are no longer available? The mice persist, but what they do is prey switch. And they start to feed on invertebrates, and they start to feed on some of the small lizards. And it's that has the major impact on a lot of our faunal biodiversity. We're not really on top of exactly how significant it is, but mice can be a real problem. I throw in the one wonderful icon of Australia, the kookaburra, because that's a foreigner to Western Australia. Again, something which can be very, very significant as far as predation goes after fire, when the ground is open and exposed, and predation is really greatly enhanced by the kookaburra's feeding ability. And last but by no means least are the invertebrates, and there is a myriad of these. This horrendous looking slide is the bottom of a 20-litre bucket. It is covered in very small millipedes, about 2 centimetres long, which are called Portuguese millipedes, and there has been an absolute invasion of those from the hills and now right across the Swan coastal plain. They are introduced species, and their impact on the native invertebrates is probably profound, but again we have no significant studies which are looking at that. But as soon as you get an idea like that, every morning I can go around my pits after a moist night and find literally thousands of these millipedes in the bottom, which just shows you how damaging they can be as far as taking over the ground and taking over the food resource, because they will in fact prey on other species. They'll even eat themselves. So invertebrates are another group which we have allowed to become invasives, and there are many examples of invertebrates Australia-wide now which have done irreparable damage. Finally, to come to fire, and this is a nice little story, I hope, which you will follow with me. This is a Chewett woodland in Bole Park as it looks in pristine state. This is a Chewett woodland as it looks after a fire in 2000. Again, I'm going to show you a plot here of how the different years change. Their assemblage of reptiles change over time after fire. The fire occurred in 2000, and to give you some indication, although this photo here shows you the edge effect of the fire to make the comparison with the area prior to it being burnt, you can see the devastation, a dead bobtail, virtually nothing left as an understory, the whole canopy burnt to a frazzle. A hot fire that erupted in 2000. When I started the study in 1986, I spent 20 days during the year studying the reptiles and getting an understanding of what was there, and I thought, that's terrific, Rick, you've done a pretty fair job. So next year I did 40 days and found that it was no use to me at all. This is a very different assemblage. So in fact I hadn't sampled for long enough or intensively enough. So in 1987 for 40 days, the following year I bumped it up to between 70 and 90 days, and what did happen was I managed to show that in this particular Chewett woodland the reptiles remained very similar, and that happened for 14 years. The blue tells me that those assemblages are very similar to one another over 14 years. The fire in 2000, so you can follow what happens in 2001, a dramatic change in the assemblage of the reptiles. That's not surprising really, because a fire like that is going to change things quite markedly. The following year, another huge change to 2002. So there is a lag effect. It stayed pretty much at that level till 2004, when it started to wend its way happily back to being a little bit the same as it'd been in 2000. And so I'm thinking, at least we are getting a recovery. This is quite exciting. Let me follow that a little longer. From 2007, I got it back into the blue zone again, which is wonderful. So I said to myself, 7 years after an intensive burn, the reptile assemblage will start to look like it did prior to the burn. The sad part about that is this year, it ruined the story completely. It's gone back out to that phase that it was immediately after the fire, And we can relate that very much to the drought year we had a year or so ago. And so there is the compounding effect of drought operating on fire, which changes reptiles' assemblages. The reason I keep coming back to reptiles is because we have no mammals to work on. And so they have long since disappeared from Bowell Park. But the reptiles are telling us a very interesting sensitivity story about responses to fire. And as I mentioned, the fourth of those 5 events is disease. The impact of plants is quite obvious and dramatic. Phytophthora on the left, a dramatic impact on Banksias, often on jarrahs. There's a heavily Phytophthora infested area on the left on the Swan Coastal Plain. Canker, another fungal attacking on a marri tree here on the right. So the impacts of disease, in this case both of them being fungi on plants, is quite obvious. As I mentioned before, the story for animals is very much more anecdotal, but there has been a very useful paper by Ian Abbott, who worked in the Department of Environment and Conservation, where he looked at all the literature and showed that in fact it was very likely that a lot of the mammals in the early days disappeared as a result of a disease, which probably started somewhere around about Shark Bay and spread south. That's from the literature, from talking to very old people. We don't have any concrete evidence for it. But a recent story that I was involved with in work on Christmas Island shows that the significance of disease can now be teased out a little bit better. Christmas Island was colonised in about 1888 with the Phosphate Company. It had 2 endemic rats, in other words, rats which were only known from that island. The following 2 years, rats got off, jumped ship and came onto the shore. And by 1906, there were in fact no native rats left at all, and everybody said competitive, the black rats from the ship just outcompeted them. And that's been the story right up until 2008, when some Americans went back to the specimens in a museum, looked at them in great detail, and found out that it wasn't actually competitive exclusion, or even it was a trypanosome that was brought in by the black rats that the native rats had no immunity to, and they just went extinct. So these are the sorts of stories that are starting to be teased out from historical information that we can get from, fortunately in this case, museum specimens. And touching on the final one, climate change, because we are now in the throes of a very marked change in rainfall events. The long-term average for Perth, 803 millimetres, is marked by the red line. Over the period of study, this is the pinkish line since about 1976 when we started the Swan Coastal Plain, there has been on average a 10% drop in mean annual rainfall. Since we got actively involved in the urban studies in about the mid-1990s, there's been a further 3% drop, so that's 13% drop to there. And the last decade has been the driest on record. We're 15% below on average. And these are the sorts of effects that are having, or are likely to have, a very marked impact on the fauna. One of the interesting things about the study I'm able to do is to look at how the animals are responding to this, and I can do that by checking body weights as against length, and you do find that in fact the animals are probably in poorer condition now than they were when the rainfall pattern was higher. But it's early days. What it does show, though, is this is a profile of the Gnangara Aquifer, the groundwater levels, and it starts in about 1975, 1979. And in the early days, there's very little drop, but as you can see, with the decrease in rainfall, the loss of height of the aquifer, in other words, the aquifer has dropped considerably. And it's not merely rainfall, but rainfall has a lot to do with it, so I'm told, but also extraction as well. So coupling the need for more water and the drier conditions has had a profound effect on this subterranean aquifer, the Gnangara Mound, and that will in fact have a very marked effect on the vegetation above it. So long-term climate changes are going to affect the vegetation. They're starting to show impacts on the fauna, and we're starting to now get some indication of how significant that might be. So very briefly, to go back to where I started from, a little picture from Bowell Park looking towards Perth City, but these 4 animals are now no longer found in the inner urban areas. We have the Tamil wallaby, very common on the Abrolhos. It is also very common on Garden Island, but it doesn't occur on the Swan Coastal Plain. Top left-hand corner is the brush-tailed phascogale or wombenga. It is still on the southern Swan coastal plain in some of the woodlands, but we certainly don't have it in Perth anymore. Occasionally the museum gets records from further south. The western ringtail possum used to be quite common around about the turn of the last century and into the 1920s around the Perth area. It hasn't been seen anywhere near here. In fact, it's naturally declined and decreased its range back onto about Bunbury, Busselton. Recent introductions have extended it further northwards, and the little ashy grey mouse again, which has in fact disappeared from inner Perth but still occurs in places like Melaleuca Park just to the north. But basically these are local extinctions. And even within Bole Park, in the 24 years I've been working there, I used to catch bardics, which are a lovely little but nonetheless aggressive and venomous snake. The last one I caught was some 17 or 18 years ago. They were there in some numbers when I first started. They haven't been caught for 17 years. I'm calling that a local extinction. Same length of time for the spotted gecko. The last one was in about 1996-7. So it's disappeared. I used to catch it occasionally. And sadly, the narrow-banded snake, which seems to have almost disappeared from all of Perth, was last caught in about 1999 at Bole Park. And the last 12 years I haven't seen any of them, despite the fact that up until then I used to catch them. So there have been, even in that 24 years, some likely local extinctions. So what does that really tell us? And I'm coming back here to make the analogy that could possibly be drawn between Geraldton and the Abrolhos, should we have the information. But in trying to predict the future, one of the things I wanted to do was use Bole Park and the intensive work that's been going on there to see what the current status was. And we have one native mammal, which is the brush-tailed possum, the last of the natives to hang on. We have 3 amphibian species and 28 reptile species in an area of about 330 hectares. To make the analogy, I've compared it to an offshore island, which of course is Rottnest in this case, which is sometimes regarded as about 5 times as large. On Rottnest we have one native mammal, that's the quokka, and we have 3 amphibians still, which is quite surprising because amphibians and islands really generally don't go together, so that's quite an encouraging figure. But as far as reptiles go, a marked loss. So we've got 9 less species despite 5 times the area. And this is what in the long run will be called an extinction debt. I've shown you that very likely some of the reptiles on Bole Park are now locally extinct, and in the end we'll find what we call a relaxation or a local extinction, so that in fact many of the species there will become extinct and we'll start to get a very impoverished fauna, because reptiles will persist for a while, but if the populations aren't high enough or you get regular fires, then those populations cannot survive. The important part really is that there are 6 less snakes on Rottnest. We just have a blind snake and the dugite there, the endemic dugite at Rottnest, but it's lost a myriad, in fact 5 or 6 beautiful small burrowing snakes that still persist in Bole Park. So I suspect, although we've lost just the one, that many of the others might disappear from Bole Park in the near future. So all is not well in the land of Perth, because we're going to lose a lot more yet. And Garden Island again is just yet another offshore island. We have a native mammal, that one is the Tammar wallaby. No amphibians, which is usually the case, but only 15 reptiles, despite its 1,100 hectares. So reptiles on Garden Island are sizably lower in number for area than they are in remnants of the urban area. What we are seduced a little bit by Perth is in fact seeing a view from the Darling Scarp and seeing lots of greenbelt and lots of area which provide connectivity. This is a little bit suspicious because a lot of these are parklands, a lot of these are tree belts, and although they are very, very useful as far as allowing movement of birds and the more mobile species, perhaps bats, certainly butterflies and the ones that fly, for most of the ground-living taxa, for the insects and most of the insects and things like lizard, it isn't a great way to look at what's going to happen. So we can expect to lose a lot more of our biodiversity in Perth over the next 20 to 30 years. Now to wind you back to the second point I really want to look at, and this is something which is probably more an appeal to think about what we ourselves can do. There is a thing called the ecological footprint, which has been devised or in fact been calculated by WWF, I've put up the top the website. What it really does, as it states at the bottom, it represents the amount of biologically productive land and sea that's needed to rectify or provide the resources that humans need and to get rid of their waste. And it's become you can use your own little calculator up there. It looks at the amount of fuel you might use getting to work, how much you consume in groceries, what sort of energy bills you have, and those sorts of things, to give you some sort of indication as to how much you as an individual might be using of the land. And this is a map of the global perspective, and the darker the areas, the higher the ecological footprint, and of course the Americans are the bête noires on that, but Australia's pretty much second. And I was at a very informative lecture last year by some preeminent American conservationists in China, and he put it in such a clear manner that I tried to encapsulate it. This is a graph of the amount of global hectares per person that is required, and if the world was operating on the ecological footprint of the Chinese, which is around about the global average, if we lived like the Chinese did, we would actually maximise the use of one globe, one of these beautiful blue spheres which is the Earth. If you look at the Australian perspective, we in fact have about a 3 1/3 requirement for our current lifestyle. We are living totally unsustainable, and of course if we go a little step further, the Americans, of course, are right over the top with their energy needs and so forth. And to support, if the world lived at the standards the North Americans do, we would need nearly 5 globes. And that really is one of the problems that we face. Certainly, technology might rectify that a little, but it can't obviate the need for us to be far more cognizant of the desires that we have on resource states, biodiversity, energy levels, clean water and food at this stage. So we as a profligate society really need to think about how we use our resources, how we use biodiversity, and what we need to do with it. And an area that's become very much an interest of mine recently is the role that native vegetation, that biodiversity in the natural world plays. These are various mosaics of children at play, but last month there was a very interesting American who came through, a chap called Richard Louv, who's written this book called The Last Child in the Woods. What he has done is coined a phrase which really rings a tune with many people, and it's called the nature deficit disorder. In his presentation he was most illuminating, and he was mentioning figures which really are quite staggering, and that is the amount of time that teenage children these days spend with some form of electronic aid, be it their phone, be it their computer, be it their iPod, and he was saying 56 hours a week for teenagers in America is the current figure. That's gone up from about 44 hours a week in about 2003. It is this disassociation with the natural world that is going to have the most profound impact. And the final part, he has actually, it's an interesting man, a journalist who went this route to in fact have a look at what the figures were telling him about the current technological revolution and what it was doing to our children. Those of us who are old like me and played in the fields or in the forest when we were young have a very different appreciation to nature from the younger people these days who spend most of their time playing video games or doing those things, and to get them out in the natural world, he said, is absolutely essential. And this final slide here is one of the things that is really so preeminent in the minds of the British at least, and is right across Europe. And this is put out by the Healthy Futures, part of the National Health Service in the UK. And it says, sustainable development acknowledges that the natural environment is essential to a healthy society. And what the research from them is showing is that it can prevent ill health by all sorts of means, by improving mood. And I suspect most of us who take a walk on the wild side probably find our mood improves, especially if we want to step out from behind our desk for a while. We also find that it increases social contact. And I know when I'm walking through Bold Park, I certainly feel far friendlier than if I'm passing somebody in the street. So in fact, these things really gel with me. It assists in the recovery from stress. Yeah, you know, if I'm having a bad day, I've got 7 calls in a row, and I've had enough, I step outside, I go and sit on the grass, and I feel a whole lot better. I can come back and face some more phone calls. It contributes to children's development. And I have a wife who's involved in the teaching profession, and I was throwing this up as an iconoclast the other day to a group of teachers, and they were saying, yes, you know, it really does it does change them. If you go out and take them onto a walk in the field, often the disruptive ones in class become the leaders once they get outside. And so it does change people's ability to perceive and to respond. Some of these seem to be a little bit overlapping, but nonetheless I'll run through them. Personal development is, of course, again related to what children really find by going in the bush. And I think in talking to lots of people as I wander through, I have this dreadful habit of jumping out from behind the bushes early in the morning when I'm studying in Bold Park, and people go, what are you doing here? Because they're having a lovely peaceful walk, and their stress levels suddenly increment dramatically at the approach of this grey-bearded old man. And by the time you finish talking to them, you realise that they've really gained an awful lot from wandering around the bush at the wee small hours and watching the sun basically rise over Perth, or often late in the evening when I'm checking the traps again as the sun sets. So their physical activity and their health is certainly improved by that, and I know myself I'm greatly encouraged by what I can actually achieve by having a brisk walk in the bush. But perhaps most importantly is its ability, the natural environment's ability to treat illness. And it's been shown to be an effective treatment for children with ADHD, and that is actually now in the literature. The British Journal of Medicine had an article recently which says that hyperactive children, in fact, can be greatly enhanced in their ability to concentrate and to perform by being taken to a natural environment. It's been shown to assist in patient recovery, especially after surgery, and that was where I first got interested in it, because they showed that, in fact, people who had intensive surgery, even if you took them out of the hospital and sat them under a tree in their wheelchair outside, generally their rate of recovery was 2 or 3 days quicker than those that didn't. Quite a marked improvement. And finally, for those of us who've had the misfortune to have parents who've had Alzheimer's, really one of the great things is that it does assist the elderly, and it really lowers their degree of anxiety. So there are these major elements of advantage to the health and well-being of people by having natural environments. So if I can just close by 3 of my most favourite slides from the November 2003 storms over Perth. The first thing I think the first strike we need to make is to understand the role of biodiversity and its importance to providing the essential services that we as humans need. And that's that ecosystem services, which I didn't go into in depth, but natural biodiversity values are very, very significant in providing the essential services to live in the natural world. The second strike is that if we do want to make sure that we are conserving biodiversity and all the benefits that it holds, we need to think as responsible individuals at decreasing our impact on the natural world. In other words, lowering our ecological footprint. And I would commend you all to just go and have a look, Google ecological footprints, have a look at what it does, feed in your own figures, and just see how profligate we are with the resources that are in scarce supply. And finally, if none of those really gel on you, the thing that you should do is be selfish, be sensible, and realise that biodiversity has great benefits to you, yourself, both in your well-being, and as you get a bit older like me, probably as your health as well. So thank you very much.